All right, welcome back. This is Rachel Stevens. I am a senior analyst with RedMonk, and with me today I have Diya Winn, and we are here for our second conversation around responsible AI. Diya works at AWS, and on our last conversation we talked about what responsible AI is and why it's important. And on this conversation we're going to talk more about how to implement it. And Diya, do you want to just do a really quick introduction to who you are, and then we can refer people back to that previous video in the comments in the show notes below if they want that background. But if you could just do a quick intro just to level set for everyone, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks for having me again. I'm glad to be back to have the second conversation. As mentioned, I'm Diya Winn. I'm at AWS in professional services and lead a practice that's specifically focused on helping and partnering with our customers on their responsible AI journey.
Wonderful. I'm so excited to dive in with you. So on our last call, we talked about just the concepts around responsible AI and how AWS is helping their customers with this problem space. And so today I want to talk a little bit more about how AI and ML is impacting businesses today. And
just to sort of ground us in this conversation, we talked a little bit about, responsible AI being important because we understand how beneficial it is to organizations and companies starting to use that, but also, wanting to be able to leverage the technology in ways that we ensure we're minimizing the impact or harm to people, and in particular to, the underrepresented or marginalized communities. Companies are using AI and ML in a number of ways to gain efficiencies or optimize and improve their processes. And I like to say to innovate in ways to tackle real world challenges. I like to say, but I think we're seeing that, play out in many of the use cases. And that's creating, benefit, but with that comes those, risks that the business has to be aware of, understand the potential for those, and then actually put in place the right kind of structure and organization to be able to address those so that they can continue to meet the needs of their customers and all of their customers, right? Building inclusive and representative products.
That makes great sense. I think one of the things about AI ML is that it can't stand on its own. Like a core element of AI ML is the data that feeds into these models. And so I'd love to talk with you today about data bias and how it actually shows up. And are there ways that you and your customers are working to identify data bias, and how are you working to mitigate it?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I guess first, when we think about bias in general refers to like a leaning or favoring of a thing or favor against or something or someone else. And when we apply that to machine learning or artificial intelligence, data in particular, it's a leaning or a skewing of the data such that it isn't complete or isn't entirely accurate, right? Then we have to take a step back and think that we all have biases. And when we think about this from a human perspective, those are unconscious errors in our thinking that might arise from problems related to our experiences or memory or attention. And you'll hear people refer to them as mental shortcuts that our brain makes to simplify and speed up our ability to interact with this complex world, right? The challenge is those biases get embedded into our data, as you were describing, and then ultimately the product and outcomes of our systems. So the biases can be counter to fairness and inclusion, and have some unintended impact. Somebody not being aware or not considering certain groups and that having an impact on that population. Just as we have to be intentional to interrupt our individual biases as humans, we have to be intentional to take steps to minimize that bias and foster inclusion in our data and in our systems. So some of the ways that we talk about that are, not just about the data itself, because as you mentioned, data is a good part of it, but it's not the only part of the story, right? Because bias can show up in our annotating the data and how it's labeled, but we could also see those in the way in which we evaluate or our outcomes and the algorithms themselves. And so we recommend that our customers, who are building models, would look at leveraging benchmarking in addition to getting, good sound data, that they would evaluate what models are appropriate, that they would institute human review, there's appropriate testing, training and validation, and that we also have some continuous improvement cycle to drive like relevant and useful insights and make the necessary improvements that are needed to continue to root out the bias and ensure for the degree of accuracy that's necessary. I would say that there are some other things that need to be considered as well, right? That you could leverage tools that actually help to reduce bias in the data and the algorithms, or and we have a tool, SageMaker Clarify, which detects bias and is one that we recommend organizations use as well as a number of the other services. But there are other tools that can be leveraged that actually aid in that process. And then there are some real, I guess, tips or other things, because we've talked about like being able to tackle this is not something that we just do with technology alone, right? It's also about staffing our teams and having development teams and the people that are going to annotate and curate our data, ensuring that they are from a diverse background, and we have the appropriate diversity even from some underrepresented groups that actually can help influence or review, drive some of the decisions, and then in the way in which data is annotated or possibly evaluated. You want to create and understand like what do we use as measures of fairness, right? And having fairness goals and metrics, right? So that you can consider what are acceptable thresholds in order to measure performance for certain subgroups or communities where necessary, depending on the case. Those are just some of the examples, but I think there are a number of others that could be inferred or that could be recommended to ensure that we really are not just relying on the systems itself or just developers itself, but a number of different places in the process that help us to mitigate bias and check for it.
So what I'm hearing from you then is that there's no silver bullet here, and it's just a holistic process that comes from the creation of the data all the way through all your processes to the outcomes, and it's a mix of people and technologies and tools. So there's a lot of consideration that needs to happen along the way in order to make sure that you are building good and responsible systems.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to just talk to you a little bit more then about what it means to get started in building this practice, and how can we start building specific programs? How can we start operationalizing some of this so that we can have responsible AI built into our organizations?
You stole a little bit of my thunder, right? But we've talked about that a bit before, that it's not just, a technology issue, right? And that the way to address this is also looking at people and process, right? Having the right operating model or operating approach to address this. One of the things that I wanted to mention was that, the way that we look at this is saying that responsible AI and operationalizing, putting those responsible principles into practice is the foundation for trust, right? And this path to trust really supports us having a positive perception of companies that use AI, that use technology, and even in the industry as a whole, right? And so we want to be, and I would say even need to ensure that AI is being trusted so that we can continue to see positive advancements. Now, when we think about, well, how do we then, or what then do customers do or companies do, then one of those things has to be just like we're intentional to interrupt our biases, being intentional to put in the structure to build responsibly. And that starts with executive leadership, right? Or companies that need the support of and commitment of their leadership to drive, this operating approach, to drive the value and importance of having responsible practices and actually using those. And in some ways, making the investment in that. Just like any organizational or transformation strategy, right? Leadership needs to lead or is one of the key sort of steps in that process. The operating model, right? Actually thinking about what do we need to do with our people and processes to adjust and align for and then support, ensuring that we have education and awareness for all of the teams and all of the members that are responsible, that have some role in developing our ML products, right? Ensuring that we have transparency and accountability, that there is appropriate accuracy that's weighted and measured for measured in the right way for fairness, that we're putting in place appropriate things for privacy and protection. Those are all part of that operating model and the processes, as well as leveraging technology to put that in place. And then I think about education and awareness, right? And in order for us to be accountable, for engineers and for the product managers and everyone else in the cycle to be accountable, they're going to need to have appropriate education and awareness. Not everybody is thinking about, the potential impacts. And there was actually a study, I believe it was in Deloitte, and they were talking about this, like the preparedness gap, that organizations have an understanding or awareness that there is the potential for risk or, acknowledgement that there could be bias and that could have an impact, but aren't necessarily equipped or educated in a way to be able to address those concerns. And so part of, an organization's responsibility is also to, bring in necessary education and awareness so that they can actually start to address those challenges. And then one last thing, I could probably go on with a number of others, but one last thing that I would mention is consider representation. And what I mean by that is consider who's not present, right? Whose voice and perspective isn't reflected in the data and part of the decisions or in the outcome or on the teams. And then we intentionally have to put those individuals and put the customer at the center. We have to include the underrepresented, right, that are or underrepresented and excluded in design and development and decisions. So we're building with them and not simply for them.
I think that's such an important point of building with rather than building for. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share just around what leaders and individuals can do to start advancing responsible AI in their organizations?
I said this, but I'll say it again. One of the things is that this isn't addressed with technology alone, right? It's going to take, considerations around people, process, as well as technology, to institute the right kind of practices to ensure that we're building fair, equitable, safe, and inclusive systems. The other, and I mentioned this, is about getting educated, not just on, not just in the technology itself, but, understanding the value and importance of diversity and inclusion, understanding your own biases and where those show up so that you can be more inclined and intentional about interrupting those, and understanding how not only do they show up, but how they influence and affect the technology that we're responsible for building. And then I guess the last thing that I would say is about being part of the solution. And that's something that we can all do. Just as we talked about earlier, we all having a responsibility in this process is, challenging ourselves to look around the room, invite others in, and actually, challenging. We have this leadership principle, disagree and commit, but sometimes it requires us disagreeing to challenge what we're seeing or the way we're approaching something, or perhaps the absence of an appropriate data set to make sure that we are, considering and creating much more inclusive technology. And then the other part, and I'm sorry, that's a little bit of our leadership principles, but I think it fits, is seeking to disconfirm our beliefs, right? This is one of the leadership principles that helps us to actually invite in other perspectives. Is really close to getting educated, right? Being part of the solution is inviting them in, not just, not just in development, but in higher places of decisions. And that's where our leaders have an impact, but also we, in community can do as well.
Well, I think those are all some really great articulations of how some of those leadership principles at AWS are potentially ways that people can help also frame how they're thinking about responsible AI. So I really appreciate your time today, Diya, to talk about all these things. And I'm legitimately sad that this conversation is over, because it's very clear that you could talk about this for a very long time and have a lot of interesting things to say. So thank you so much for coming and sharing some of these interesting things with me, because this has been lovely.
Thank you too. I appreciate the time.